Welcome to Stories with Liz. Today we're doing Edith Wharton and her short story called Miss Mary Pask, a fun little ghost story. And it was first released in 1926. Miss Mary Pask. It was not till the following spring that I plucked up the courage to tell Mrs. Brightworth what had happened to me that night in Morgat. In the first place, Mrs. Bridgeworth was in America, and after the night in question I lingered on abroad for several months, not for pleasure, God knows, but because of a nervous collapse, supposed to be the result of having taken up my work again too soon after my touch of fever in Egypt. But in any case, if I had been door to door with Mary Bridgeworth, I could not have spoken of the affair before, to her or to anyone else, not until I had been rest-cured and built up again at one of those wonderful Swiss sanatoria where they clean the cobwebs out of you. I could not even have written to her not to save my life. The happenings of that night had to be overlaid with layer upon layer of time and forgetfulness before I could tolerate any return to them. The beginning was idiotically simple, just the sudden reflex of a New England conscience acting on a feeble constitution. I had been painting in Brittany, in lovely uncertain autumn weather, one day all blue and silver, the next shrieking gale and driving fog. There was a rough little whitewashed inn out on the Pointe du Rose, swarmed over by tourists in the summer, but a sea-washed solitude in autumn, and there I was staying and trying to do waves when someone said, "You ought to go to Cape something else, beyond Morgat." I went, and had a silver and a blue day there, and on the way back the name of Morgat set up unexpected associations of ideas. Morgat. Grace Bridgeworth. Grace's sister. Mary Pask. "You know my darling Mary has a little place now near Morgat. If you ever go to Brittany, do go see her. She lives such a lonely life. It makes me so unhappy." That was the way it came about. I had known Mrs. Bridgeworth well for years, but had only a hasty, intermittent acquaintance with Mary Pask, her older and unmarried sister. Grace and she were greatly attached to each other. I knew it had been Grace's chief sorrow when she married my old friend Horace Bridgeworth and went to live in New York, that Mary, from whom she had never before been separated, obstinately lingered in Europe, where the two sisters had been traveling since their mother's death. I never quite understood why Mary Pask refused to join Grace in America. Grace said it was because she was too artistic. But, knowing the elder Miss Pask and the extremely elementary nature of her interest in art, I wonder whether it was not rather because she disliked Horace Bridgeworth. There was a third alternative, more conceivable if one knew Horace, and that was that she liked him a bit too much. But that again became unattainable, at least I supposed it did, when one knew Mrs. Pask. Mrs. Pask, with her round flushed face, her innocent bulging eyes, her old maidish flat decorated with art tidies, and her vague and timid philanthropy, aspired to Horace. Well, it was all rather puzzling, or would have been if it had been interesting enough to be worth puzzling over. But it was not. Mary Pask was like 100 other dowdy old maids, cheerfully content with their innumerable little substitutes for living. Even Grace would not have interested me particularly if she hadn't happened to marry one of my oldest friends and to be kind to his friends. She was a handsome, capable, and rather dull woman, absorbed in her husband and children, and without an ounce of imagination. And between her attachment to her sister Mary Pask's worship of her, there lay the inevitable gulf between the feeling of the sentimentally unemployed and those whose affections are satisfied. But a close intimacy had linked the two sisters before Grace's marriage, and Grace was one of the sweet, conscientious women who go on using the language of devotion about people whom they live happily without seeing, so that when she said, "You know it's years since Mary and I have been together, not since little Molly was born. If only she'd come to America. Just think, Molly is 6, and she has never seen her dear auntie." When she said this and added, "If you go to Brittany, promise me you'll look up Mary," I was moved in that dim depths of where unconscious obligations are contracted. And so it came about that, on that silver and blue afternoon, the idea, morgat, Mary Pask, to please Grace, suddenly unlocked the sense of duty within me. Very well. I should chuck a few things into my bag, do my day's painting, and go see Mrs. Pask when the light faded, and spend the night at the inn in Morgat. To this end I ordered a rickety one-horse vehicle to await me at the inn when I got back from my painting, and in it I started out towards sunset to hunt for Mary Pask. As suddenly as a pair of hands clapped over one's eyes, the sea fog came down upon us. A minute before we had been driving over a wide bare upland, our backs turned to a sunset that crimsoned the road ahead. Now the daintiest night enveloped us. No one had been able to tell me exactly where Mrs. Pask lived, but I thought it likely that I should find out at the fisher's hamlet towards which we were trying to make our way. And I was right. An old man in a doorway said, "Yes, over the next rise, and then down a lane to the left that led to the sea. The American lady who always used to dress in white." Oh, he knew. Near the Baie des Traspes. "Yes, but how can we see to find it? I don't know the place," grumbled the reluctant boy who was driving me. "You will when we get there," I remarked. "Yes, and the horse thundered meantime. I can't risk it, sir. I'll get in trouble with the patron." Finally, an opportune argument induced him to get out and lead the stumbling horse, and we continued on our way. We seemed to crawl on for a long time through the wet blackness, impenetrable to the glimmer of our only lamp, but now and then the pall lifted or its folds divided, and then our feeble lights would drag out the night some perfectly commonplace object, a white gate, a cow's staring face, a heap of roadside stones, made portentous and incredible by being thus detached from its setting, capriciously thrust at us, and as suddenly withdrawn. After each of these projections the darkness grew 3 times as thick, and the sense I had for some time of descending a gradual slope now became of scrambling down a precipice. I jumped out hurriedly and joined my young driver at the horse's head. "I can't go on. I won't, sir," he whimpered. "Why, see, there's a light over there, just ahead." The veil swayed aside, and we beheld 2 faintly illuminated squares in low mass that was surely to be the front of a house. "Get me as far as that, then you can go back if you like." The veil dropped again, but the boy had seen the lights and took heart. Certainly there was a house ahead of us, and certainly it must be Mrs. Pask's, since there could hardly be 2 houses in such a desert. Besides, the old man in the hamlet had said, "Near the sea," and those endless modulations of the ocean's voice, so familiar in every corner of the Burton land that one gets to measure distances by them rather than by visual means, had told me for some time past that we must be making for the shore. The boy continued to lead the horse on without making any answer. The fog had shut in more closely than ever, and our lamp merely showed us the big round drops of wet on the horse's shaggy quarters. The boy stopped with a jerk. "There's no house. We're going straight down to the sea." "But you saw those lights, didn't you?" "I thought I did. But where are they now?" "The fog's thinner again. Look, I can make out trees ahead, but there are no lights no more." "Perhaps the people have gone to bed," I suggested jocosely. "Then hadn't we better turn back, sir?" What? 2 yards from the gate? The boy was silent. Certainly there was a gate ahead, and presumably behind the dripping trees some sort of dwelling, unless there was just the field and the sea. The sea, whose hungry voice I heard asking and asking close below us. No wonder the place was called the Bay of the Dead. But what could have induced the rosy, benevolent Mary Pask to come and bury herself here? Of course the boy wouldn't wait for me. I knew that. The Bay des Trespes, indeed. The sea whined down there as if it were feeding time, and the furious, its keeper, had forgotten it. There was the gate. My hand had struck against it. I felt along to the latch, undid it, and brushed between wet bushes to the house front. Not a candle glint anywhere. If the house were indeed Mrs. Pask's, she certainly kept early hours. Night and fog were now one, and darkness as thick as a blanket. I felt vainly about for a bell. At last my hand came in contact with the knocker, and I lifted it. The chatter with which it fell sent a prolonged echo through the silence, but for a minute or two nothing else happened. "There's no one there, I tell you," the boy called impatiently from the gate. But there was. I heard no steps inside, but presently a bolt shot back, and an old woman in a peasant's cap pushed her head out. She had set her candle down on a table behind her, so that her face, aureoled with lazy wings, was in obscurity, but I knew she was old by the stoop of her shoulders and her fumbling movements. The candlelight, which made her invisible, fell full on my face, and she looked at me. "This is Mary Pask's house." "Yes, sir." Her voice, a very old voice, was pleasant enough, surprising and even friendly. "I'll tell her," she added, shuffling off. "Do you think she'll see me?" I threw after her. "Oh, why not? The idea!" She almost chuckled. As she retreated, I saw she was wrapped in a shawl and had caught an umbrella under her arm. Obviously she was going out, perhaps going home for the night. I wondered if Miss Mary Pask lived all alone in her hermitage. The old woman disappeared with the candle, and I was left in total darkness. After an interval, I heard a door shut at the back of the house, and then a slow clumping of aged sabots along the flags outside. The old woman had evidently picked up her sabots in the kitchen and left the house. I wondered if she had told Mrs. Pask of my presence before going, or whether she had just left me there, the butt of some grim practical joke of her own. Certainly there was no sound within doors. The footsteps died out, I heard a gate click, and then complete silence closed in again like the fog. I wonder, I began within myself, and at that moment a smothered memory struggled abruptly to the surface of my languid mind. But she is dead! Mary Pask is dead! I almost screamed aloud in my amazement. It was incredible, the tricks my memory had been playing with me since my fever. I had known for nearly a year that Mrs. Pask was dead, had died suddenly the previous autumn, and though I'd been thinking about her almost continuously for the last 2 or 3 days, it was only now that the forgotten fact of her death suddenly burst up again to my consciousness. Dead. But hadn't I found Grace Brightworth in tears and crepe the very day I had gone to bid her goodbye before sailing for Egypt? Hadn't she laid the cable before my eyes, her own streaming with tears while I read, "Sister died suddenly this morning, requested burial in garden of house, particulars by letters," with the signature of the American consul to Brest, a friend of Brightworth's, I seem to recall. I could see the very words of the message printed on the darkness before me. As I stood there, I was a good deal more disturbed by the discovery of the gap in my memory than by the fact of being alone in a pitch-dark house, either empty or otherwise inhabited by strangers. Once before of late I had noticed this queer temporarily blotting out of some well-known facts, and here was a second instance of it. Decidedly, I wasn't as well over my illness as my doctors had told me. Well, I would get back to Morgat and lie up for a day or two, doing nothing, just eating and sleeping. In my self-absorption, I had lost my bearings, and no longer remembered where the door was. I felt in every pocket in turn for a match, but since the doctors had made me give up smoking, why should I have found one? The failure to find a match increased my sense of irritated helplessness, and I was groping clumsily about the hall among the angles and unseen furniture when a light slanted along the rough-cast walls of the stairs. I followed its direction, and on the landing above me I saw a figure in white, shading a candle with one hand and looking down. A chill ran down my spine, for the figure bore a strange resemblance to that of Mary Pask as I used to know her. "Oh, it's you!" she exclaimed in the crackled, tittering voice, which was the moment like an old woman's quiver, at another like a boy's falsetto. She came shuffling down in her baggy white garments, with her usual clumsy swaying movements, but I noticed that her steps on the wooden stairs were soundless. Well, they would be, naturally. I stood without a word, gazing up at the strange vision above me, and saying to myself, "There's nothing there, nothing whatever. It's your digestion, or your eyes, or something damned wrong with you somewhere." But there was the candle at any rate, and as it drew nearer and lit up the place about me, I turned and caught hold of the door latch, for remember, I had seen the cable in Gray's and Crape. "Why, what's the matter? I assure you, you don't disturb me." The white figure tittered, adding with a faint laugh, "I don't have so many visitors nowadays." She had reached the hall and stood before me, lifting her candle shakily and peering up into my face. "You haven't changed, not as much as I'd thought. But I have, haven't I?" She appealed to me with another laugh, and abruptly she laid her hand on my arm. I looked down at the hand and thought to myself, that can't deceive me. I have always been a noticer of hands, the key to a character that other people see in the eyes, the mouth, the modeling of the skull. I find in the curve of the nails, the cut of the fingertips, the way of the palm, rosy or sallow, smooth or seamed, swells up from its base. I remembered Mrs. Pask's hand vividly because it was so like a caricature of herself, round, puffy pink, yet prematurely old and useless. And there, unmistakably, it lay on my sleeve, but changed and shriveled, somehow like one of those pale freckled toadstools that the least touch resolves to dust. Well, to dust, of course. I looked at the soft wrinkled fingers with their foolish little oval fingertips that used to be so innocently and naturally pink and now were blue under the yellowing nails, and my flesh rose in ridges of fear. Come in," she fluttered, cocking her white, untidied head on one side and rolling her bludgeoning eyes at me. The horrible thing was that she still practiced the same arts, all the childish wails of a clumsy, capering coquetry. I felt her pull on my sleeve, and it drew me in her wake like a cable. The room she led me into was, well, unchanged in the term generally used in such cases, for as a rule, after people die, things are tidied up, furniture is sold, remembrances are dispatched to the family, but some morbid piety of Grace's instructions, perhaps, had kept this room looking exactly as I supposed it had in Mrs. Pask's lifetime. I wasn't in the mood for noticing details, but in the faint dabble of moving candlelight, I was half aware of bedraggled cushions, odds and ends of copper pots, and a jar holding a faded branch of some late-flowering shrub. A real Mrs. Pask interior. The white figure flittered spectrally to the chimney-piece, lit 2 more candles, and set down the third on the table. I hadn't supposed I was superstitious, but those 3 candles. Hardly knowing what I did, I hurriedly bent down and blew one out. Her laugh sounded behind me. 3 candles! You still mind such a thing? I've got beyond all that, you know, she chuckled. Such a comfort, such a sense of freedom. A fresh shiver joined the others already cursing over me. Come, sit by me, she entreated, sinking to a sofa. It is such an age since I've seen a living being. Her choice of terms was certainly strange, and as she leaned back on the white slippery sofa and beckoned me with one of those unburied hands, my impulse was to turn and run. But her old face hovering there in the candlelight, with the unnaturally red cheeks like varnished apples, and the blue eyes swimming in vague kindliness, seemed to appeal to me against my cowardice, to remind me that, dead or alive, Mrs. Pask would never hurt a fly. Do sit down, she repeated, and I took the other corner of the sofa. It is so wonderfully good of you. I suppose Grace asked you to come. She laughed again. Her conversation had always been punctuated by rambling laughter. It's an event, quite an event. I've had so few visitors since my death, you see. Another bucketful of cold water ran over me, but I looked at her resolutely, and again the innocence of her face disarmed me. I cleared my throat and spoke, with a huge panting effort, as if I had been heaving up a gravestone. You live here alone? I brought out. Oh, I'm glad to hear your voice. I still remember voices, though I hear so few, she muttered dreamily. Yes, I live here alone. The old woman you saw goes away at night. She won't stay after dark. She says she can't. Isn't it funny? But it doesn't matter. I like the darkness. She leaned to me with one of her irrelevant smiles. The dead, she said, naturally gets used to it. Once more I cleared my throat, but nothing followed. She continued to gaze at me with confidential blinks. And Grace, tell me about my darling. I wish I could have seen her again, just once. Her laughter came out grotesquely. When she got the news of my death, were you with her? Was she terribly upset? I stumbled to my feet with a meaningless stammer. I couldn't answer. I couldn't go on looking at her. Ah, I see. It's too painful. She acquiesced, her eyes brimming, and she turned her shaking head away. But after all, I am glad she was sorry. It's what I've been longing to be told, and hardly hoped for. Grace forgets. She stood up too, and flitted across the room, wavering nearer and nearer to the door. Thank God, I thought, she's going. Do you know this place by daylight? She asked abruptly. I shook my head. It is very beautiful, but you know, you wouldn't have seen me then. You'd have to take your choice between me and the landscape. I hate the light. It makes my head ache. And so I sleep all day. I was just waking up when you came." She smiled at me with an increasing air of confidence. "Do you know where I usually sleep?" "Down below, there in the garden." Her laughter shrilled out again. "There's a shady corner at the bottom there where the sun never bothers one. Sometimes I sleep there till the stars come out." The phrase about the garden in the consul's cable came back to me, and I thought, after all, it's not such an unhappy state. I wonder if she isn't better off than when she was alive. Perhaps she was, but I was sure I wasn't in her company, and her way of sliding nearer to the door made me distinctly want to reach it before she did. In a rush of cowardice I strode towards it. But a second later she had the latch in her hand and was leaning against the panels, her long white raiment hanging about her like grave clothes. She dropped her head a little sideways and peered at me under her lashless lids. "You are not going?" she reproached me. I dived down in vain for my missing voice, and silently signed that I was. "Going? Going away? Altogether?" Her eyes were still fixed on me, and I saw 2 tears gather in the corner to run down on the red, glistening circles of her cheeks. "Oh, but you mustn't," she said gently. "I'm too lonely." I stammered something inarticulate, my eyes on the blue-nailed hand that grasped the latch. Suddenly the window behind us crushed open, and a gust of wind surging in out of the blackness extinguished the candle on the nearest chimney corner. I glanced back nervously to see if the other candle were going out too. "You don't like the noise of the wind. I do. It's all I have to talk to. People don't like me much since I've been dead. Queer, isn't it? The peasants are so superstitious. At times, I am really lonely." Her voice cracked in a last effort at laughter, and she swayed toward me, one hand still on the latch. "Lonely, lonely, if you ever knew how lonely. It was a lie when I told you I wasn't, and now you come, and your face looks friendly, and you say you're going to leave me. No, no, you shan't. Or else, why did you come? It's cruel. I used to think I knew what loneliness was, after Grace married, you know. Grace thought she was always thinking of me, but she wasn't. She called me darling, but she was thinking of her husband and children. I said to myself then, you couldn't be more lonely if you were dead. But I know better now. There's been no loneliness like this last year's. None. And sometimes I sit here and think, if a man came along some day and took a fancy to you." She gave another wavering crackle. "Well, such things have happened, you know. Even after youth is gone. A man who's had his troubles too." Suddenly she flung herself towards me. "Oh, stay with me. Stay with me. Only tonight. Nobody needs to know. No one will ever come and trouble us." I ought to have shut the window when the first gust came. I might have known there would soon be another, fiercer one. It came now, slamming back those loose hinged lattices, filling the room with the noise of the sea and with wet swirls of fog, and dashing the other candles to the floor. The light went out, and I stood there. We stood there, lost to each other in the roaring, coiling darkness. My heart seemed to stop beating. I had to fetch up my breath with great heaves that covered me with sweat. The door, the door. Well, I knew I had been facing it when the candle went. Something white and rat-like seemed to melt and crumple up before me in the night, and avoiding the spot where it had slunk away, I stumbled around it in a wide circle, got the latch in my hand, caught my foot in a scarf or sleeve, trailing loose and invisible, and freed myself with a jerk from the last obstacle. I had the door open now. As I got into the hall, I heard a whimper from the blackness behind me, but I scrambled onto the hall door, dragged it open, and bolted out into the night. I slammed the door on that pitiful low whimper, and the fog and wind enveloped me in its healing arms. When I was well enough to trust myself to think about it all again, I found that a very little thinking got my temperature up and my heart hammering in my throat. No use, I simply couldn't stand it. For I'd seen Grace Brightworth in crape, weeping over the cable, and yet I'd sat and talked with her sister on the same sofa, her sister who had been dead for a year. The circle was a vicious one. I couldn't break through it. The fact that I was down with fever the next morning might have explained it, yet I couldn't get away from the clanging reality of the vision. Supposing it was a ghost I had been talking to, and not a mere projection of my fever. Supposing something survived of Mary Pask, enough to cry out to me the unuttered loneliness of a lifetime, to express at last what that living woman had always had to keep dumb and hidden. The thought moved me curiously. In my weakness, I lay and wept over it. No end of women were like that, I supposed, and perhaps after death, if they got their chance, they tried to use it. Old tales and legends floated around my brain, the Bride of Corinth, the medieval vampire, but what names to attach to the image of Mary Pask? My weak mind wandered in and out among these visions and conjectures, and the longer I lived with them, the more convinced I became that something which had been Mary Pask had talked with me that night. I made up my mind when I was up again to drive back to the place in broad daylight this time, to hunt out the grave in the garden, that shady corner where the sun never bothers one, and appease the poor ghost with a few flowers on the grave. But the doctors decided otherwise, and perhaps my weak will unknowingly abetted them. At any rate, I yielded to their insistence that I should be driven straight from my hotel to the train for Paris, and thence shipped, like a piece of luggage, to the Swiss sanatorium they had in view for me. Of course, I meant to come back when I was all patched up again. And meanwhile, more and more tenderly, but more intermittently, my thoughts went back from my snow mountain to that wailing autumn night above the Baie de Traspes, and the revelation of the dead Mary Pask, who was so much more real to me than the living one had ever been. After all, why should I tell Mary Brightworth? Ever? I had a glimpse of things that were really no business of hers. If the revelation had been vouchsafed to me, ought I not to bury it in those deepest depths where the inexplicable and unforgettable sleeps together? And besides, what interest could there be to a woman like Grace in the tale she could neither understand nor believe in? She would just set me down as queer, and enough people had done that already. My first object, when I finally did get back to New York, was to convince everybody of my complete return to mental and physical soundness, and into this scheme of evidence my experience with Mary Pask did not seem to fit. All things considered, I would hold my tongue. But after a while, the thought of the grave began to trouble me. I wondered if Grace had ever a proper gravestone put on it. The queer, neglected look of the house gave me the idea that perhaps she had done nothing, had brushed the whole matter aside to be attended to when she next went abroad. Grace forgets, I heard the ghost quaver. No, decidedly, there could be no harm in putting, tactfully, just that one question about the care of the grave, the more so as I was beginning to reproach myself for not having gone back to see with my own eyes how it was kept. Grace and Horace welcomed me with all their old friendliness, and I soon slipped into the habit of dropping in on them for meals when I thought they were likely to be alone. Nevertheless, my opportunity didn't come at once. I had to wait for some weeks. And then, one evening, when Horace was dining out, I sat alone with Grace. My glance lit on a photograph of her sister, an old faded photograph which seemed to meet my eyes reproachfully. "By the way, Grace," I began with a jerk, "I don't believe I ever told you I went down to that little piece of your sister's the day before I had that bad relapse." At once her face lit up emotionally. "No, you never told me." "How sweet of you to go." The ready tears overbrimmed her eyes. "I am so glad you did." She lowered her voice and added softly, "And did you see her?" The question sent one of the old shudders over me. I looked with amazement at Mrs. Brightworth's plump face, smiling at me through a veil of painless tears. "I do reproach myself more and more about my darling Mary," she added tumultuously. "But tell me everything." There was a knot in my throat. I felt almost as comfortable as I had in Mary Pask's own presence. Yet I had never before noticed anything uncanny about Grace Brightworth. I forced my voice up to my lips. "Everything? Oh, I can't." I tried to smile. "But you did see her." I managed to nod, still smiling. Her face grew suddenly haggard. Yes, haggard. "And the change was so dreadful that you can't speak of it? Tell me, was that it?" I shook my head. After all, what had shocked me was that the change was so slight, that between being dead and alive there seemed after all to be so little difference, except that of a mysterious increase in reality. But Grace's eyes were still searching me insistently. "You must tell me," she reiterated. "I know I ought to have gone there long ago." "Yes, perhaps you ought." I hesitated. "To see about the grave, at least." She sat silent, her eyes still fixed on my face. Her tears had stopped, but her look of solicitude slowly grew into a stare of something like terror. Hesitatingly, almost reluctantly, she stretched out her hand and laid it on mine for an instant. "Dear old friend," she began. "Unfortunately," I interrupted, "I couldn't get back myself to see the grave because I was taken ill the next day." Yes, of course, I know." She paused. "Are you sure you went there at all?" she asked abruptly. "Sure? Good Lord!" It was my turn to stare. "Do you suspect me of not being quite right yet?" I suggested with an uneasy laugh. No, of course not." "But I don't understand." "Understand what? I went to the house, I saw everything, in fact, but the grave." "Her grave?" Grace jumped up, clasping her hands on the breast and darting away from me. At the other end of the room she stood and gazed and then moved slowly back. "Then after all, I wonder." She held her eyes on me, half fearful and half reassured. "Could it be simply that you never heard?" "Never heard?" "But it was in all the papers. Don't you ever read them?" "I meant to write. I thought I had written. But I said, at any rate he'll see it in the papers. You know I'm always lazy about letters." "See what in the papers?" "Why, that she didn't die." "She isn't dead." "There isn't any grave, my dear man." "It was only a cataleptic trance. An extraordinary case, the doctor said." "But didn't she tell you about it, if you said you saw her?" She burst into half-hysterical laughter. "Surely she must have told you that she wasn't dead." "No." I said slowly. She didn't tell me that. We talked about it together for a long time after that. Talked on till Horace came back from his men's dinner after midnight. Grace insisted on going in and out of the whole subject over and over again, and she kept repeating it was certainly the only time that poor Mary had ever been in the papers. But though I sat and listened patiently, I couldn't get up any real interest in what she said. I felt I should never again be interested in Mary Pask or in anything concerning her. The end. What a wonderful big twist at the end there. I hope you enjoyed it and was surprised too. Hope to see you next week. Have a good week till then.